You're alone at night. You open Netflix. And somehow, once again, you find yourself clicking on another true crime documentary. Another murder. Another investigation. Another deep dive into humanity's darkest moments. And here's what's strange. You know exactly what's going to happen. Someone died. Someone killed them. The police will investigate. You'll learn every gruesome detail. Yet you can't look away. Your friends do it too. Your mother does it. Millions of people, every single night, voluntarily choosing to watch the worst things humans do to each other. Why? Most people will tell you it's just entertainment, curiosity, a harmless fascination. But Michel Foucault, one of the most brilliant and controversial philosophers of the 20th century, would tell you something very different. Something that might make you uncomfortable. Because what you're really doing when you watch these documentaries isn't what you think. And once you understand what Foucault discovered about power, surveillance, and the human psyche, you'll never watch true crime the same way again. Let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. When you watch these documentaries, whose perspective are you watching from? Are you identifying with the victim? Feeling their fear and pain? Or are you watching from somewhere else? From the detective's chair? From the prosecutor's position? From the all-seeing eye that knows everything, sees everything, judges everything? Because here's what Foucault understood that most people don't. We don't just consume these stories passively. We participate in them. We become part of a system, a very specific system of power that has shaped modern society in ways we barely recognize. And your true crime obsession? It's not just about curiosity or entertainment, or even morbid fascination. It's about something much deeper, something that goes to the core of who you are in modern society and how you've been trained to think about right and wrong, normal and abnormal, us and them. This is The Quiet Depths, and today we're going to explore what your love of true crime, documentaries, reveals about your psyche through the lens of Michel Foucault's philosophy. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to see yourself differently. But first, we need to understand who Foucault was and why his ideas matter so much to this conversation. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher who lived from 1926 to 1984. He was brilliant, controversial, and absolutely obsessed with understanding how power works in society. But Foucault didn't study power the way most people think about it. He wasn't interested in kings and presidents and obvious displays of force. Instead, he studied the subtle, invisible ways that power operates in our daily lives. The ways it shapes how we think, how we see ourselves, and how we judge others. He spent years studying prisons, hospitals, schools, and mental institutions. And what he discovered was shocking. Modern society doesn't primarily control people through violence or force. It controls people by making them control themselves. He studied how we categorize people as normal or abnormal, how we define criminal versus law-abiding, how we determine who's sane and who's mentally ill. And here's the disturbing part. Foucault argued that we've all internalized these categories so deeply that we police ourselves and each other without even realizing it. We've become our own jailers, our own judges, our own surveillance system. Now you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me watching Making a Murderer? Everything? It has everything to do with it. Because when you watch true crime, you're not just passively consuming content. You're actively participating in the exact system Foucault spent his life analyzing. You're training yourself to think like the system wants you to think. And that's where this gets really interesting. In 1975, Foucault published a book called Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison. It's one of the most important philosophy books of the 20th century, and it completely changed how we understand crime, punishment, and social control. Foucault starts the book with a horrifying description. In 1757, a man named Robert Francois Damiens tried to assassinate King Louis XV of France. He failed, and his punishment was public execution in the most brutal way imaginable. I won't describe the details here, but it involved torture that lasted for hours in front of a massive crowd. This was normal for the time. Public executions were entertainment, spectacle, the ultimate display of the king's power over the body. But then Foucault jumps forward just 80 years. He shows you a prison schedule from 1837. Wake up at this time. Eat at this time. Work at this time. Every moment of the prisoner's day controlled and regulated. And Foucault asks, what happened? How did we go from public torture spectacles to these quiet, organized, bureaucratic prisons in less than a century? Most people would say, oh, we became more civilized, more humane. We stopped being barbaric. But Foucault said no, that's not what happened at all. What happened was that power changed strategies. It became smarter, more efficient, more total. Public executions were actually inefficient. They were expensive. They sometimes created sympathy for the criminal. The crowd might riot. The spectacle could backfire. So society developed a new system. Instead of destroying the body in public, we would reform the soul in private. Instead of one big violent display, we would have constant, continuous surveillance and discipline. And this is where it gets interesting for you, the true crime viewer. Foucault was obsessed with a prison design called the Panopticon, created by philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s. Imagine a circular prison. In the center is a watchtower. Around the perimeter are cells. Each cell is backlit, so the guard in the tower can see into every cell clearly. But the tower is designed so prisoners can't see whether a guard is actually watching them or not. Here's the genius of this design. Prisoners never know if they're being watched at any specific moment, so they have to assume they're always being watched, which means they start to discipline themselves. They internalize the surveillance. They become their own guards. Eventually, you don't even need a guard in the tower. The prisoners will behave as if they're being watched anyway. Foucault argued that modern society works exactly like the Panopticon. We're all in this circular prison where we might be watched at any moment, so we police our own behavior. We internalize the rules. We become our own surveillance system. Think about it. Security cameras everywhere. Social media where everything you post is permanent and public. Your search history tracked. Your location monitored. Performance reviews at work. Standardized tests at school. Credit scores. Background checks. You're always potentially being observed. So you learn to observe yourself, to judge yourself by the standards of the system. And here's where true crime comes in. When you watch these documentaries, you're not just being entertained. You're training yourself in the art of surveillance. You're learning to think like the system thinks, to see like the system sees, to judge like the system judges. You're sitting in that watchtower, looking down at the criminals in their cells, learning what abnormal looks like so you can make sure you never become it. Let's get personal for a moment. Let's talk about you specifically. You watch these documentaries, and you tell yourself it's because you're curious, because you want to understand what makes someone become a killer, because you're interested in psychology or criminology or justice. And maybe that's partly true. But Foucault would ask you to look deeper, to examine not just what you're watching, but how you're watching, what position you're watching from, what role you're playing in this narrative. Here's what I think is really happening, and see if this resonates with you. When you watch true crime, you feel safe. You feel in control. You're looking at chaos and violence and the breakdown of social order, but you're looking at it from a position of safety. You're on the right side of the line that separates normal from criminal, law-abiding from deviant, use from them, and that feels good, doesn't it? There's a comfort in knowing where the boundaries are, in seeing someone who crossed them and got caught, in watching the system restore order. You're not identifying with the criminal. You're identifying with the judge, the detective, the jury, the all-seeing eye that knows who's guilty and demands they be punished. You're participating in what Foucault called the examination, the constant process of observing, documenting, categorizing, and judging individuals to determine if they're normal or abnormal. And the more you do this, the more you internalize these categories. The more you learn to examine yourself and everyone around you through this same lens. Am I normal? Is my behavior acceptable? Are my thoughts okay? How would I look if I were being investigated? What would people find if they examined my life the way they examine these criminals? Now here's where this gets really uncomfortable, and I need you to stay with me because this is important. Foucault argued that we're fascinated by criminals, not because they're so different from us, but because they're not different enough. They remind us how close we all are to crossing the line, how arbitrary the line sometimes is, how easily we could have been on the other side. Think about the true crime cases that fascinate you most. Are they the random, senseless violence? The serial killers who are clearly insane? Or are they the cases that are more ambiguous? The person who killed in self-defense but maybe used too much force? The mother who snapped after years of abuse? The person who made one terrible decision that spiraled out of control? The cases where you can almost understand why it happened, where you can see the human being behind the crime. Those are the ones that captivate us, because those are the ones where we see ourselves, where we recognize that under different circumstances, with different pressures, maybe we could have made similar choices. And that's terrifying. So we need to distance ourselves. We need to reassure ourselves that we're fundamentally different, that we're on the right side of the line. So we watch these documentaries and we judge, we examine, we analyze. We determine what went wrong with this person that made them different from us. We participate in the system of categorization and control. We internalize it. We become it. And Foucault would say, this is exactly how power operates in modern society. Not through force, but through making us complicit in our own surveillance and control. There's another element to true crime documentaries that Foucault would find absolutely fascinating: the confession. In almost every true crime story, there's a moment we're all waiting for. The interrogation, the confession, the moment when the criminal admits what they did. Why are we so obsessed with this moment? Foucault studied the history of confession extensively. He traced it from religious confession in medieval Christianity through modern psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and criminal interrogation. And he made a shocking observation. Our society is built on confession. We believe that the truth about who you really are exists deep inside you, and it must be extracted, spoken, examined, and judged. We confess to priests, therapists, doctors, police, social media. We're constantly being asked to reveal ourselves, to be authentic, to share our inner truth. And we've learned that confession is how you're absolved. If you confess, if you admit what you did, if you show remorse, then maybe you can be forgiven. Maybe you can be reformed. Maybe you can become normal again. True crime documentaries are obsessed with getting the confession because it's the moment of maximum power. It's when the system has finally penetrated into the deepest, most private part of the individual and extracted their truth. And when you watch this moment, you're participating in it. You're the audience that demands confession. That needs to hear the criminal admit their crime and explain themselves. You're part of the machinery that produces what Foucault called the truth of the individual. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is ridiculous. I'm just watching a documentary. I'm not participating in any system of control. I'm not surveilling anyone. This is just entertainment. And this is exactly what Foucault would predict you'd think. Because that's how power works best, when it's invisible. When we don't recognize ourselves as part of the system. Let me ask you this. After you watch a true crime documentary, do you ever talk about it with friends? Do you discuss the case? Share your theories? Debate whether someone was really guilty or innocent? Do you ever Google the case afterward? Read articles? Watch YouTube videos analyzing every detail? Join Reddit threads discussing the evidence? Do you ever think about the case when you see someone who reminds you of the criminal? Do you sometimes look at people around you and wonder what they might be hiding? Do you pay more attention to red flags in people's behavior? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you're not an innocent viewer. You're an active participant. You're practicing surveillance. You're training yourself to examine, categorize, and judge. And here's the thing. The system doesn't care if you think you're just having fun. It doesn't care if you think it's just a hobby or an interest. The effect is the same. You're learning to think like the system thinks, to see the world through the lens of normal versus abnormal, criminal versus law-abiding, us versus them. You're internalizing the gaze, becoming your own surveillance system. Here's where Foucault's philosophy gets really radical. He didn't just argue that society controls criminals. He argued that society produces criminals. That crime itself is partly a social construction created and maintained because it serves a function. What function? Control of the general population. Think about it. Crime gives us an enemy, someone to fear, someone to distinguish ourselves from. Crime justifies surveillance, police, prisons, laws, restrictions on freedom. Crime creates jobs, industries, entire systems of power. Foucault argued that society doesn't really want to eliminate crime. It wants to manage it, control it, keep it at a level that's useful for maintaining social order and justifying the existence of disciplinary institutions. And true crime documentaries play right into this. They remind us constantly that dangerous people exist, that we need to be vigilant, that we need surveillance and control and punishment to keep us safe. They teach us to be afraid of the abnormal, the deviant, the criminal. And in doing so, they teach us to police ourselves and each other. Now, you might be thinking this sounds paranoid, conspiratorial. Surely crime is real. Surely we need to investigate and punish criminals. And Foucault would agree. He wasn't saying crime doesn't exist or shouldn't be addressed. He was saying something more subtle and more disturbing, that how we think about crime, how we define it, who we label as criminal, and how we respond to it are all shaped by systems of power that serve specific interests. And when you consume true crime content, you're absorbing these definitions and categories. You're learning to think inside the system. So let's bring this back to you personally. Why does any of this matter? Why should you care what some French philosopher thinks about your Netflix habits? Because understanding this changes how you see yourself and the world around you. If Foucault is right, then your true crime obsession isn't just a harmless hobby. It's part of how you're being trained to participate in modern systems of social control. Every time you watch a documentary and judge the criminal, you're practicing judgment. You're learning to see people through the lens of normal versus abnormal. Every time you examine the evidence and decide if someone is guilty, you're learning to examine, to surveil, to investigate. Every time you feel that satisfaction when the criminal is caught and punished, you're participating in the machinery of discipline and punishment. And all of this shapes how you see yourself, how you judge your own thoughts and behaviors, how much you police yourself. Think about your own internal dialogue. How often do you think things like, "That was weird. Why did I do that?" Or, "I shouldn't think this way." Or, "What people think if they knew this about me?" That's the internalized surveillance. The watchtower you've built in your own mind. The Panopticon you carry with you everywhere. And true crime documentaries feed this. They reinforce the categories. They remind you where the boundaries are. They show you what happens when someone crosses them. They keep you in line. Foucault had another fascinating insight that relates directly to true crime. He argued that in modern society, we're all performing normalcy. We're all constantly trying to demonstrate that we're on the right side of the line. Think about your social media. Do you post everything you think and do? Or do you curate it? Present a version of yourself that's acceptable, normal, appropriate? Think about your behavior in public. Do you act exactly the same way you act when you're alone? Or do you modulate it? Adjust it? Perform the version of yourself that won't be judged as abnormal? We're all doing this constantly. We're all under surveillance, so we've learned to present ourselves as surveillable subjects, as normal, law-abiding, appropriate people. And true crime documentaries teach us exactly what not to do, what not to be, what behaviors, interests, lifestyle choices, or personality traits might mark us as potentially abnormal or dangerous. They're like instruction manuals for performing normalcy. Case studies in what happens when you fail the test. Have you ever watched a true crime documentary and thought, wow, I do that thing that they said was a red flag? Maybe you're a loner. Maybe you have unusual interests. Maybe you have a history of mental health struggles. Maybe you've had conflicts with others. And suddenly, you're aware that these things could be interpreted as concerning. That someone watching you might see you the way the documentary presents the criminal. So you adjust. You hide. You perform normalcy more carefully. That's the Panopticon working. That's internalized surveillance. That's you becoming your own guard. Here's something I want you to consider. When you watch true crime documentaries, you're looking at a dark mirror. You're seeing the version of humanity that society has designated as unacceptable, as criminal, as abnormal. But Foucault would remind you that these categories aren't natural or inevitable. They're socially constructed. They change over time and across cultures. Here's something I want you to consider. When you watch true crime documentaries, you're looking at a dark mirror. You're seeing the version of humanity that society has designated as unacceptable, as criminal, as abnormal. But Foucault would remind you that these categories aren't natural or inevitable. They're socially constructed. They change over time and across cultures. Things that were once criminal are now legal. Things that were once acceptable are now crimes. The line moves. The categories shift. What counts as normal or abnormal is always being negotiated and redefined. So when you look at that criminal on screen, you're not looking at someone who is fundamentally, essentially different from you. You're looking at someone who ended up on the wrong side of a socially constructed line. And that could have been you, under different circumstances, with different pressures, in a different time or place. This isn't to excuse criminal behavior. It's not to say nothing is wrong or everything is relative. It's to say something more nuanced, that the way we think about crime and criminals is shaped by power structures, and those structures serve specific interests. And when you consume true crime content uncritically, you're absorbing these categories and interests as if they're natural and inevitable. You're learning to see the world through the eyes of power, to judge through the lens of social control, to police yourself and others according to standards that may not actually serve your interests or well-being. So now let's talk about why you can't stop watching, why you binge entire seasons of true crime documentaries in one sitting, why you keep coming back for more. Foucault would say it's because these documentaries are fulfilling a psychological need created by living in a surveillance society. You live in a world where you're constantly being evaluated, where you never know if you're being watched, where you're always potentially being judged as normal or abnormal. That creates anxiety, uncertainty, a need to know where the boundaries are, to see examples of what's unacceptable so you can make sure you're staying on the right side of the line. True crime documentaries provide that reassurance. They show you clearly what abnormal looks like, what criminal behavior is, what happens when someone crosses the line. and they let you participate in the judgment. You get to sit in the watchtower. You get to examine and evaluate and determine guilt or innocence. That feels powerful, safe, comforting. It's the same psychological mechanism that makes gossip so addictive. When you talk about someone else's scandal or failure or weird behavior, you're engaging in social surveillance. You're participating in the collective process of defining and enforcing normal behavior. And it feels good because it confirms that you're on the inside. You're part of the group doing the judging, not the one being judged. True crime documentaries are just formalized, professionalized, mass-produced gossip. They're surveillance entertainment. They're judgment porn. And you're addicted because the underlying anxiety that created the need never goes away. You still live in the Panopticon. You still need to know where the boundaries are. So you keep watching. So what do you do with this information? Should you stop watching true crime documentaries? Foucault wouldn't necessarily say that. He wasn't a moralist telling you what you should or shouldn't do. He was an analyst helping you understand the systems you're embedded in. But understanding these systems does give you power. The power to see them, to recognize your participation in them, to choose consciously how you engage with them. So here's what I suggest. Keep watching if you enjoy it, but watch differently. Watch with awareness. Notice when you're judging. Notice when you're participating in the examination. Notice when you're reinforcing categories of normal and abnormal. Ask yourself, whose perspective am I watching from? Who benefits from this narrative being told this way? What social functions is this serving? Notice how these documentaries make you feel about yourself and others. Do they increase your fear and suspicion? Do they make you more judgmental? Do they make you more anxious about your own normalcy? And most importantly, notice the internalized surveillance. Notice when you're policing your own thoughts and behaviors based on these socially constructed categories. Because here's the thing. Foucault believed that recognizing these systems is the first step toward having some freedom within them. You can't escape the Panopticon, but you can at least see the watchtower. You can understand the game being played. And that understanding changes everything. So let's come back to the original question. If you like true crime documentaries, what does this reveal about your psyche according to Foucault? It reveals that you're a product of modern disciplinary society. You've internalized the gaze. You've learned to surveil, examine, judge, and categorize. You've built a watchtower in your own mind. But it also reveals something else, something that might surprise you. Your attraction to true crime documentaries suggests that you're aware, at some level, of living in a surveillance society. You're anxious about the boundaries. You're uncertain about what counts as normal. You're trying to navigate a world where you're constantly being evaluated. And that awareness, even if it's unconscious, is actually the beginning of something important. It's the crack in the system, the moment when you start to see the machinery. Most people live their entire lives completely unaware that they're in the Panopticon. They think their thoughts are their own. Their judgments are natural and objective. Their categories are real and inevitable. But you're watching true crime documentaries compulsively, which suggests that at some level, you feel the pressure of the system. You sense that something is watching, that you're being evaluated, that you need to understand the rules. And that anxious awareness is actually the first step toward consciousness, toward recognizing the systems you're embedded in, toward having some choice about how you participate in them. So in a strange way, your true crime obsession might be the thing that wakes you up, that helps you see what Foucault spent his life trying to illuminate. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Foucault wants you to understand. We're all complicit in the systems that control us. We're not innocent victims. We're not just being controlled from the outside by some external force. We've internalized the control. We've made it part of ourselves. Every time you judge someone for being weird or abnormal, Every time you police your own behavior to fit in, every time you participate in surveillance, whether by watching true crime or gossiping or checking social media or any of the 1,000 ways we observe and evaluate each other constantly, you're part of the machinery. You're keeping the system running. You're your own guard in the Panopticon. And that's hard to accept, because we like to think of ourselves as free, as independent, as individuals making our own choices based on our own values. But Foucault would say, look closer. Examine where your values came from, how your judgments were formed, what taught you to see the world the way you see it. And you'll find that so much of what you think is your own authentic self is actually the result of these systems working on you since birth, teaching you, molding you, making you into a productive, self-policing subject. That's not to say you have no agency or freedom, but it is to say that your freedom is always already constrained and shaped by these systems. You're playing a game with predetermined rules, and most of the time you don't even realize you're playing. But here's where this gets hopeful, because once you see the system, once you understand how it works, you can start to reclaim your gaze. You can start to choose consciously what you pay attention to, how you judge, what categories you accept and which ones you question. You can practice what Foucault called critical consciousness, the ability to step back and examine the systems you're embedded in, to see how power operates, to recognize your own participation in it. And that doesn't mean you suddenly transcend the system or escape it completely. You're still in the Panopticon. But now you can see the watchtower. You know it's there. You understand how it works. And that knowledge is power. Not the power to control others, but the power to have some autonomy within the constraints you're living in. So when you watch true crime documentaries now, you can watch with different eyes, not just accepting the narrative being presented, not just participating unconsciously in surveillance and judgment, but watching critically, asking questions, noticing what's being shown and what's being hidden, whose perspective you're being given and whose is excluded. You can start to see true crime documentaries not as simple entertainment, but as artifacts of our surveillance society, as training manuals for internalized control, as mirrors showing you not just the criminals, but yourself and the systems you're part of. This brings us to a deeper question that Foucault spent his whole career exploring. What kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a society organized around constant surveillance and judgment, where everyone is always examining everyone else, categorizing them as normal or abnormal, where we're all performing acceptable versions of ourselves, hiding anything that might be seen as deviant? Or do we want something different? Something with more freedom, more acceptance of difference, more tolerance for the complexity and messiness of being human? Because here's what Foucault understood. The system doesn't maintain itself through force. It maintains itself through our participation, through our internalization of its values and categories, through our willingness to police ourselves and each other, which means we have more power than we realize, not individually, but collectively. If we start questioning these categories, if we stop participating so enthusiastically in surveillance and judgment, if we create spaces where different ways of being are acceptable, the system starts to lose its grip. True crime documentaries are just one small part of this larger system, but they're a revealing part. They show us how invested we are in maintaining these boundaries between normal and criminal, acceptable and deviant, us and them. And every time you watch critically with awareness, questioning the narrative, recognizing your own participation in the machinery of control, you're exercising a small bit of freedom. You're saying, I see what you're doing. I understand the game, and I'm choosing how I play. So how do you live with this consciousness? How do you exist in a surveillance society once you've seen the watchtower? Foucault would say, carefully, critically, with awareness. You can't escape the systems you're embedded in, but you can navigate them with more consciousness and intentionality. You can notice when you're judging yourself or others based on internalized categories. You can question whether those categories actually make sense or serve your interests. You can choose what information you consume and how you consume it. You can decide consciously to watch true crime documentaries as a form of entertainment, while also recognizing their role in reinforcing social control. You can practice empathy even for people who've done terrible things, not excusing their actions, but recognizing their humanity, seeing them as products of systems and circumstances, not as essentially fundamentally different from you. You can resist the urge to perform normalcy quite so carefully. Maybe you can let yourself be a little weirder, a little more authentic, a little less concerned with constant surveillance. Because here's the paradox. The more you try to perfectly perform normalcy, the more anxious and constrained you become. The more you let yourself be seen, even with all your oddities and flaws, the freer you feel. That doesn't mean being reckless, but it means recognizing that the watchtower's power depends on you internalizing it, and you can choose to give it less power over you. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Your true crime obsession is neither good nor bad. It's revealing. It's a window into the systems that shape modern consciousness. It's a symptom of living in a surveillance society. And now that you understand this, you have a choice. You can continue watching exactly as you have been, participating unconsciously in these systems of control and judgment. Or you can watch differently, with awareness, with critical consciousness, recognizing what you're seeing and what you're participating in. Foucault believed that consciousness itself was a form of resistance. That seeing the systems of power was the first step toward having some freedom within them. So the next time you open Netflix and click on another true crime documentary, pause for a moment. Notice what you're about to do. Notice the attraction you feel. Notice what perspective you're about to watch from. Are you the detective, the judge, the surveillance system itself? And ask yourself, is this how I want to think? Are these the categories I want to accept? Is this the kind of judgment I want to participate in? You don't have to stop watching, but you can start seeing, and that changes everything. Because once you see the watchtower, you can never unsee it. Once you recognize the Panopticon, you understand that you're both prisoner and guard, both watched and watcher. And in that recognition, in that moment of consciousness, you find a small space of freedom. Not freedom from the system, but freedom within it. The freedom to choose consciously how you participate. The freedom to question. The freedom to resist. So that's what your love of true crime documentaries reveals about your psyche, according to Michel Foucault. You're a product of modern disciplinary society. You've internalized surveillance and judgment. You're training yourself to be your own guard. But you're also searching, anxious, trying to understand the boundaries and rules of a society that constantly evaluates you. And that searching, that anxiety, that awareness, even if unconscious, is the crack in the system, the beginning of consciousness. What you do with that consciousness is up to you. Thank you for watching. If this video made you see your true crime obsession differently, hit that like button. If you want more deep dives into philosophy and psychology, subscribe. And if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about yourself and society, stick around. Because we're just getting started. The watchtower is always there. But now you can see it. And that changes everything.